which is systemic racism and endemic racism and institutional racism, and how we got here, what were the forces that pushed our society in that direction, unfortunately. And I think by understanding some of those past events, it helps people with respect to formulating policies going forward that make sense and are good for, in our case, good for Huntington Woods and our residents, because that's the responsibility that I personally have as a city commissioner, and I can't, we don't have the power or the authority or the resource to cure all the problems, but I think that for a city like ours, these types of educational seminars, I think, are very valuable. I'll tell you what brings us today to Mr. Cawley, who is a historian and is a member of the Berkeley Historic Commission. Is I purchased a book not long ago. Actually, you can get it at like CVS and places like that. It's called Images of America, Berkeley. The authors are Jeffrey Tong, Dr. Susan Richardson, who I see is joining us tonight, and who I'm very appreciative of for turning us on to Jason, and also Steve Baker. And it's a very short history of the city of Berkeley, and of course prominent in the book is as a clear discussion about the role that the Ku Klux Klan played in the history of the city. And there's also reference to the priest, Father Coughlin, who began his career before the Shrine of the Big Flower was opened, broadcasting from Burton School. And for those of you, I'm certain that everybody on this Zoom knows who Father Coughlin was, but I can tell you, when you talk to millennials, they have no idea who Father Coughlin was. It's just about, if you talk to anybody under the age of 50, they're not sure who Father Coughlin was. But he was a vile anti-Semitic, pro-Hitler priest who preached vile anti-Semitic, pro-Hitler sermons to his parishioners and to his network. There are those who regard him as the father of contemporary right-wing radio as we know it, that there are people that ascribe its rise to the popularity of Father Coughlin. So like I said, I think that the benefit to this type of a program is it does give us a chance to learn something about I've lived in Huntington Woods now for 44 years. And I mean, before I moved here, what did I know about Berkeley? I grew up in Northwest Detroit, so I didn't know anything about Berkeley or anything like that. But over the years, you begin to see all the pieces that came together to forge the area that we have today. So, Jason, I'm going to let you take it away here tonight. And again, on behalf of the library and the residents of Huntington Woods, we appreciate you spending time with us tonight. Go ahead.
All right, thanks, Jules. And thank you everyone for choosing to spend your Thursday evening listening to this particular topic. If I had realized at the time we scheduled this that it was going to be Alex Trebek's second last episode on Jeopardy, I would have scheduled for a different date. I hope everyone's got their DVR set. I know we lost it last night because of everything else that was going on that was crazy. So anyway, again, thank you all for being here tonight. I'm going to go ahead and switch over to sharing my screen here so we can dive right into the presentation itself. Let's see. That's the one. All right. And let me see here. See if I can't fix this. There we go. Looks good for everyone. I realize no one can talk at this point. So yes, okay, great. Thank you, Dale. All right, let me just minimize this here so I can get this out of my way. All right, so as far as the topic for tonight, the second wave of the Ku Klux Klan. That's the last time I'm going to say the full name because it's just too hard to pronounce all the time. I'm just going to say the Klan from here on out. What do I mean by the second wave of the Klan? Historically, going all the way back to Reconstruction, this historians view the Klan in sort of three successive waves. There was the original post-Reconstruction wave. That was the first wave. That was the initial birth of the Klan itself. Then there was the second wave, which is what we're going to focus in on tonight. And this largely took place between the late 19-teens and through the 1920s. And it really peaked in the mid-20s and then kind of died off from there before picking up into a third wave. And that was more a reaction to the civil rights movement, and largely took place in the 1960s. So again, we're going to be focusing on the second wave tonight. And that would be a time when the Klan was at its most successful at any point in time throughout history. During this time frame, it's estimated that roughly 5 million Americans were members. And again, that's just an estimate. It's a secret society, so by its very nature, we don't actually know how many people were members themselves. But overall, they estimate 5 million, not to mention anyone else who was basically as sympathetic to the point where there was no distinction. Now, zeroing in on the second wave here, it began largely in the South. And at first, the growth of it was fairly slow, and it was confined to the South itself. Then this book, The Klansman, the copy that you see here on your screen is actually a copy that's kept at the Clawson Historical Museum on their bookshelf there, donated by some former resident at some point. This is a historical romance, the Ku Klux Klan. Basically, it's a historical retelling of the Reconstruction era Klan, the first wave. The book was optioned into a movie called The Birth of a Nation. This movie itself is often credited as being sort of one of the revolutionary films of its time for moving movies out of the 15-minute Nickelodeons and into full feature-length 90-minute films. And it was a sensation across the country. It was even shown at the White House at one point. President Wilson was quite a fan, it's remarked upon. And this film itself was used as a propaganda tool, as well as the book itself, as the Klan started to expand and grow more aggressively later in the 20s. This film was shown repeatedly throughout the country in various different places, even years after it had originally come out. There was no internet, there was no TV back then, so reruns of movies was a pretty common feature. And this was used very specifically for that purpose. Let's see. Now, throughout the early mid-20s, this is when they really went through their most expansionist phase, particularly here in Michigan. And one of the ways they did that was to really sort of change the narrative. Early on, when they were confined to the South in the late teens and stuff, there was a lot of violence associated with them, tar and feather parties and running people out of town on a rail and things like that. And so by the time they started to shift towards the North and shift their attention there, they really wanted to change the narrative about what they were and what they were about and what they were trying to sell to people. And so they really kind of wrapped themselves in the American flag and associated themselves largely with these American patriotic holidays when it came to recruitment and sort of PR reasons. So they'd have these large parades that would take place oftentimes during, Memorial Day, Veterans Day, 4th of July, holidays like that, even Flag Day at one point. That was one of the parades that took place. And this was just one of the many ways that they used to sort of normalize themselves and just be another patriotic organization that people would join because they love their country. Another way that they would sort of incorporate themselves into everyday life is this notion called clannishness. It's never really fully properly defined, at least not in a way that I could find so far. But clannishness was sort of a way of how Klansmen, Klanswomen would treat one another and sort of create this community amongst themselves. During this time, we started to see, and what we see here is a funeral procession for Max Tyler, and this was in Hart, Michigan. So there was Klan-themed funerals, there was Klan-themed weddings. One was supposedly took place in Royal Oak that I still don't have too many details on, but I'm looking into, and even baptisms at some point. And over here on the far left, you'll see Correct Cleaners. This was in downtown Royal Oak. They advertised many times throughout the mid-20s using this repeated motif of the KKK, the Crawl Correct Cleaner. And in this particular book, Everyday Klansfolk by Craig Fox, he really goes into a lot of detail about the ways that a lot of businesses use these sort of secretive messages and things like that to sort of keep business within the community itself. Also very popular during this time were things called Simwa clubs, which stood for Spend Your Money with Americans. And this was another way of sort of keeping the money within the Klan and trying to create these economic bases and another reason for people to sort of join and be members. It was sort of a perk of membership, as it were. I do list on here that there was a Klan-only lake resort planned in North Oakland County. And this was another part of the Klanishness and sort of the idea of creating these Klan structures. And in this case, it was a lake resort that was going to be only for Klansmen. The deal fell through. It never quite came to be. And that's another thing that I'm still doing a little bit of research on. It's listed as Lake Schwartz, but I can't find a Lake Schwartz in North Oakland County anywhere. But I'm still looking into that. But that was a common thing that would be done at the time. Klan in every sense. Now, originally, when the second wave Klan formed, particularly in the late teens and the early 20s, it was a men's only organization. Only men could join until sometime around 1923 or so. Down in Indiana, it was originally announced that there'd be a women's organization. And then very shortly thereafter, that women's organization was introduced to Michigan, the realm of Michigan, as they called it back then. It should be worth noting at this time, 1923, that women had only had the right to vote for 3 years. Coming up 1924 would be the second time in American history that women would be participating in a presidential vote. So this was a very intentional sort of marketing, not just for incorporating the Klan into everyday life, but really to sort of consolidate some political control and bring these women into the fold as far as counting votes as well. And then towards the end, it was also extended to a children's group that was sort of like the Boy Scouts, but for the Klan. There's only a few cases of this being recorded on. It doesn't seem like it was a very widespread, popular type of program. And that's partly due to the fact that the second wave Klan came and went as fast as it did. So it didn't really have time to really take root and take off. But as you can see here, it was a thing that existed, and creepy as that is. Okay, so Klan and Protestantism. This is where, following on that same theme of incorporating themselves into everyday life, this particular wave of the Klan was fairly focused on Protestant Christianity. And that was when they would tout the Bible and tout the cross and everything like that. It was specifically Protestant Christianity that they were, heralding during this time. Locally, the First Baptist Church of Berkeley, which no longer exists, it formerly was at the corner of Coolidge and Dorothea. They would often advertise, as you can see here, one was a topic offered, the Klansman Creed. They often would also advertise that the Klan would stop by for their services and visit. And one of the other ways that the local Klan chapters would work, and when Berkeley developed its own, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, one of the officers that would operate within the Klan, the local Klan chapter, would be like a chaplain. And most likely in Berkeley, the chaplain that they had for their clavern came from the Baptist church, just based on the familiarity that they seemed to have and the friendliness they had with our local Klan. But it wasn't restricted strictly to the Baptists themselves. The Berkeley Community Church, which is non-denominational and still stands to this day, they reportedly received some funds in early 1924 when they were trying to pay off their mortgage and expand their church itself. And part of those funds went to adding a belfry onto the front of the building. And this, again, this was just a part of the way that the Klan would ingratiate itself and become part of just everyday life within a small town community. You know, even your preacher was a member, and even he was speaking friendly about it. And this wasn't universally the case. The Presbyterians in Royal Oaks, they certainly were skeptical. They had a number of talks, as you can see in the far lower left-hand corner here. Is the Ku Klux Klan a national menace was one of their topics, along with whether or not the evolution theory is destructive to the Christian faith. So they were a little more open-minded overall, and so they were generally a little more resistant to the Klan being incorporated into their congregation itself. Now, with the Catholics, on the other hand, it was just outright hostility, especially during this phase. Oftentimes, when people think of the Klan, they think of the bigotry and the racism that's associated with them, as far as like their stance towards Black people or immigrants or minorities, or towards people of Jewish faith. Those are well-known opinions. And what's often forgotten, especially during this particular wave of the Klan, is that they were very anti-Catholic. It was a primary focus of theirs during this particular time. And a lot of that had to do with immigration itself. Immigration policy at the time had a lot of people coming in from Italy and from other sections of Catholic Europe. And that was tied in with their own notions of xenophobia and things like that. So Catholicism became associated with immigration. There was lots of wild theories during this time that the Pope was directing all sorts of insurgencies by way of the Knights of Columbus. As you can see here, here's the Klansman Creed that I had mentioned before. And this was printed in every edition of the Indiana version of the Fiery Cross, their local Klan paper. In some form or another, this was always printed there. And a number of these tenets really just are direct rebukes or directly address Catholicism itself. And that's how focused they really were on it. You know, like, I believe in a church that is not grounded on the principles of morality and justice is a mockery to God and to man. They're aiming that sentence at the Catholic Church. And a lot of this also had to do not only with immigration, but also with school control. They were big fans of public school, not big fans of Catholic schools. And at the time, public schools weren't as common or as widespread as they are now. And so a lot of schools were sort of filled in by Catholics at the time. And so obviously they weren't big fans of that either. And again, I'll be going into some more specific examples here in a little bit about very specific acts of violence against local Catholics, including a little bit about with Father Coughlin. We'll get into that in just a bit. One other thing I wanted to note before I move on, with this whole anti-Catholic phase that they went through too, another common thing that you'd see would be these nun shows, like this convent cruelties tale here. And in this case, it's a story that you can purchase by mail and it would get mailed back to you. But they were often live talks that you'd pay to get into. And they'd be by supposed former nuns who were in these convents that were actually, you know, these lurid sex dungeons, and they were just playthings for the priests, and all these really wild stories to try and drum up anti-Catholic sentiment. In fact, one of these talks was given in Dearborn, I think in 1925. I'd have to go back and check, but these were pretty common during this time, and a lot of people would attend them. Now, as to Klan and the news media, as I previously mentioned, they did have their own papers. Indiana had its version of the Fiery Cross. Michigan had its own version of the Fiery Cross. There was also the Courier with a K. That in Michigan specifically, but also pretty much in every state where there was some large Klan presence, you were likely going to find some Klan printed newspaper. Barring that, especially early on in the 1920s, they focused their early recruitment on small town newspaper reporters, small town newspaper editors to try and get them to their side to curry favorable coverage for their expansion efforts. And in many cases, they were successful with that, or at the very least, they'd have neutral coverage or no coverage at all. Though in some cases, there were some local media that either were privy to that, they would attend the secret meeting during the initiation phase, but then they would report the entire thing in their paper. That happened a couple of times here in Michigan. And then, of course, there was the Kalamazoo Augustinian, which was a Catholic paper. And as you can imagine, they were not big fans of the Klan, and they spoke out against the Klan on a very frequent basis, almost to the point where some of the stuff they were saying was almost untruthful, because it was like, wow, this they were editorializing a little too much. Now, in the background here on the screen, you'll see there's a series of the Daily Tribunes. And all the way on the far right, you'll see that tiny little section that's highlighted. Now, this right here is an example of how the Daily Tribune, specifically here in Royal Oak, kind of had a lack of enthusiasm for covering the Klan during this phase. This particular newspaper is from 1927. And what you're seeing highlighted there, way down on the third page, is a story about a 15-foot cross that was burned on the playground of St. Mary's Catholic School in downtown Royal Oak. This was reported the day after the event took place. And this is just to give an example of sort of how disinterested they were in covering an event like this, and how commonplace they were at this point, that it's not even front page news. It's not even really, it's sort of wedged between a couple little items about so-and-so winning a local raffle. So there was kind of a lack, even though I'm relying on a lot of local coverage from this time, there was also a lot to be desired about the local coverage that was provided during this time. And I'll go into that in a little bit more detail here in a bit. Okay, so that's sort of the general broad strokes of the second wave Klan. Now I'm going to get more into some of the nitty gritty details of how they were operating locally, more specifically. So if you had any questions going forward, think of them now, write them down. We'll go over a Q&A at the end. But now we're going to get more into the specifics rather than the generals. Okay, so beginning at the beginning, like I said before, the big push into Michigan as far as recruitment goes during this phase was in 1923. Now, this just so happens to coincide with the same year that Berkeley became a village. A couple of years after that, Huntington Woods came along and became a village themselves. Beginning in January, the Royal Oak Tribune reports that 60 members have joined locally, and that 3 meetings have taken place at the local Oddfellows Hall. And this was reported after a fiery cross was seen burning in the downtown area. Fast forward a few months later, and that's where you see this photo here, this KKK baptism of 1,000 neophytes. They don't actually specify where in Oakland County this took place. They just say 36 miles north of Detroit. I found some other accounts at the time sort of put it somewhere in Troy. So I don't know the precise location of where this took place, but this was a massive event where it was a staged media event as well. There's a reason why this was front page news on the Free Press. That's because they invited a Free Press reporter to report on it. The person, whoever the PR handler was for the reporter themselves, tried to tell them that there was 11,000 in attendance for this particular thing, but the reporter themselves sort of skeptically said, I mean, it's a big crowd, but I think it's closer to 8,000. And this was commonplace during this time. A lot of these numbers where I'm reporting 5,000 attend or 1,000 or initiated are to be taken with a grain of salt, because largely the source of information for how many attended or how many were added are provided by Klan handlers during this time. But anyway, so this event here, which took place in June of 23, this likely would have been where a lot of local Klansmen were initiated at the time. Just a month later, there was another open air initiation at 7 Mile and Coolidge on a farm there. It was reported that local police tried to gain entry to the ceremony as it was taking place because it was viewable by the road and there was this huge fiery cross. But there were guards at the entrance that denied them admission. And it was reported that up to 1,000 members were added that night as well. And again, these were just 2 months apart from one another, both within a couple miles of Berkeley. So between these two events, that's most likely when the birth of the Klan in Berkeley itself was properly formed. And sure enough, just 2 days after that that open air meeting at 7 in Coolidge, we get a report from the Daily Tribune that there was a large cross burned at 4th and Lafayette, or 4th and Washington rather, right in downtown Royal Oak, and that 500 members are reported to now be meeting regularly at the Oddfellow Hall nearby. So just between January and July of that same year, it went from 50, 60 members up to 500 members meeting locally nearby. And then, of course, less than 2 weeks after that, there was yet another open air initiation. This one was a little more specific. This was at 15 Mile and Rochester Road, where up to 1,000 attended. We don't know how many were initiated. They don't say in the newspaper article. One thing they do note during this particular initiation that took place in Clawson is that the common refrain, "Henry Ford for president," to loud cheers is heard over and over again, hinting towards there being definite political motivations behind this group as well. And then I just learned about this the other day. Then shortly thereafter, there was one more large open air picnic, and this was specifically for the women's organization. And this was in September of 1923. Again, they don't say, I don't have the actual news account for this one, so I don't know specifically where it took place, but it was somewhere near Detroit, supposedly just north of the city, somewhere in South Oakland County, where thousands of women attended an all-day picnic, and they report that several hundred were initiated during that time as well. So even from the outset, as the Klan was getting established here in the area, the women's program was already getting started at the exact same time. And coinciding with that, we have some of the real estate advertising. Now this, I'm going to diverge from talking strictly about the Klan here for a moment and just talk about Berkeley and the surrounding area and how it was being marketed during this particular time frame. Ignoring the first photo there in the upper left-hand corner about St. John Woods, but going down beneath that, we see the first ad there, where in the center there I have it highlighted that they very much specify that this is a right in the center of a village of American neighbors, and white American neighborhood is used in another one, and you will live in a home neighborhood among American-speaking people. The reason they're not saying white very often is because it's sort of moot to put that into the real estate advertising. The colored section was separately listed in the local real estate ads at the time, so you didn't really need to go out of your way to say this is whites only. But by repeatedly saying American neighbors or American-speaking neighbors or American neighborhood, this was very much understood to be coded language at the time, sort of a dog whistle to people who were maybe members of the Klan or sympathetic to that, or they didn't want to live near foreigners, because there was a lot of immigration into Detroit during this particular time frame. A lot of people coming from lots of different places, not just overseas, but from across the country. And rather than it being sort of a melting pot, it was really more of sort of a patchwork quilt of this ethnic neighborhood here, this religious neighborhood over there, and this particular area, North Woodward, was sort of marketed as this area that would be the place for white Protestants to live and feel comfortable, particularly those that came up from the South looking for factory jobs during this expansion period. Now, going back to this one advertisement for St. John Woods, this particular ad is from much later than this particular time frame. It's from the late 30s. But by then you see that this whole subdivision is carefully restricted to the Caucasian race only. And this is a decade after the Klan had formally died out in the area. And yet you still see these sort of housing policies. And by this point, in fact, it was mandated by the federal government that these types of race restrictions be put into place. But the reason that this whole area was decided to be white to begin with had to do with the events and things that were taking place right at the founding in the 20s itself, if that makes sense to everyone. If not, write it down. We'll go over that at the end. Now, it wasn't just advertising that that made this into a white area. It was actual legal documents, legal instruments, and this was discovered or discussed in the previous talk in this series. These particular covenants are from actual covenants nearby. These are from either Berkeley or Huntington Woods. The one at the bottom there in particular is from Huntington Woods, and that is actually not so much from an individual house. That is the language that is written into the whole of the Huntington Woods Homeowners Association section for the whole front of the woods area. So that entire subdivision was under the same racial restriction. Now, during this particular time frame, this is when these instruments were actually first rolled out. In Berkeley, we start to see them just as the actual farms are being converted directly into residential neighborhoods. So right from the outset, beginning in the late 1916s, late 19 teens into the early 20s, is when these sort of covenants are being placed directly onto the properties. And speaking of patchwork quilts, that's how these covenants ended up as well. So you kind of had multiple overlapping layers because Berkeley itself was so over subdivided into these tiny little subdivisions, and each individual subdivision had its own racial covenants. And then someone would move in and maybe they'd place their own, or a builder would buy a whole row of houses on a street, a row of lots to build, and he'd place his own restrictions. And then of course, later into the 30s, as the feds got into backing mortgages, they had their own requirements as well. Now, going into this particular time frame, while the Klan was running around doing the things they were doing, parading around, there was only one case that I can find where these particular laws were actually challenged in court, and that was in Huntington Woods. It was in 1925 when a man named Eugene White purchased a corner lot in the Huntington Manor subdivision. So this is west of the golf course itself. Now, he was buying it directly from the property developers themselves. It wasn't a third party or anything like that. What they didn't know at the time when they were selling him the lot, which apparently was done completely non-face-to-face, was that he was Asian American. And they successfully sued him in Oakland County Circuit Court, had an injunction placed so that he could not do anything with the land. He couldn't build on it, he couldn't develop on it, and he was obligated to sell it to someone of the Caucasian race. So these weren't just words on a sheet of paper. As we often talk about covenants nowadays, we go, oh, those haven't been enforceable for so long. During this time frame, they were enforceable. This is when they were literally being written to begin with, and they were enforced. And I think there's very much a reason that this story about Huntington Woods made it into the newspaper, and that's because they went out of their way to really make an example of this. This was the developers themselves demonstrating that they were willing to sue someone to prevent them from building in their area, specifically because of these covenants. And so they wanted to make sure that they were telegraphing to the world that their money was where their mouth was, kind of, so to speak. Now, during this time frame, as I mentioned, this is when Berkeley itself was being created, and so there was a lot of interest in politics at the local level, which also coincided with a very big focus on politics by the Klan themselves. During the mid-20s, the images you're seeing here are from 1925 and 1924. Yes, both. Parades that took place in Washington, D.C. to really demonstrate again their commitment to Americanism that they were so fond of reminding everyone. You'll note here that all the flags are American flags. There's no Confederate flags. They weren't doing that just yet. They were still very much about touting how American they were. Now, locally, we see this interest in politics express itself first in a big rally held in downtown Royal Oak in September of 1923, where the Grand Cyclops of New Jersey gave a pretty detailed political speech. By detailed, I mean it was actually covered pretty well in the local papers as to what he talked about, as opposed to he just came and gave a speech. And during this, he makes it clear that 1924 will be the year that they run the presidential election. And this is what they were focused on. And again, this kind of ties in with where they started up with the women's organization in 1923, is that they had a focus on national politics and not just local politics. Though, of course, they were very interested in local politics as well, both big and small. They publicly supported candidates in Detroit during this time frame, 5 candidates for city council, as well as a mayoral candidate. Now, the the candidate for mayor didn't win, but they did win all 5 of their council candidates for several years. And locally, we also saw this as well. In our own historical records, we do have one flyer from a 1927 race that took place here in Berkeley. And that's actually mentioned, is shown in the book that Jules had mentioned earlier, the local history book. They show a picture of this particular flyer. What they don't mention in this book, and it was something that I had to go track down myself, and part of the reason I did all this research, was who won this race that the Klan was advocating for in this particular flyer. And I had to go find that out. And it turns out that the Klan-backed candidate for village president ended up winning. And it was by a razor-thin majority of 5 votes out of 953 cast. A fellow candidate for local village council also ran and won, in addition to the city clerk and the city treasurer, who are all recommended by the Klan and all won their seats. Now, Oliver Swords himself was a pretty important figure locally. He published a local paper called the Berkeley Review. He also did some editorial work for the Daily Tribune in Royal Oak as well. And besides winning that first seat to the village presidency, he won re-election a year later. And again, it was by a very, very thin vote. And I think the vote count is important here because oftentimes there's an idea that Berkeley was sort of the center of the Klan during this time frame. And while there was a lot of Klansfolk running around, there were just as many people who lived here who were Catholic, who were immigrants, who were just plain old not fans of the Klan. And so these races were often highly contentious and very, very, very close. And I just wanted to make sure that was noted. And again, we'll talk about this in a little more detail in a bit. Specifically right now. The very first election in Berkeley in 1923, again, it coincided with this big push of trying to spread throughout the state of Michigan itself. And so when we had this first election, it was later in the summer. It was in August of 1923. We had the first election because they had to do all the charter and stuff to sort of formally form the village itself early in 1923. So they had the actual first election for who would run the town later on in the year. And here we see a race between 2 men, Martin Loftus and C. Arthur Dunton. Dunton was a real estate developer who had worked for one of the property developers in Berkeley. He also owned the Northwood Inn at Catalpa and Woodward. And he was running against Martin Loftus, who owned a small business on 12 Mile. He was also a local Catholic and a member of the Our Lady of Refuge parish, right in Berkeley and Catalpa. In response to his candidacy, the Klan burned a cross in front of his church while he was inside organizing a Catholic festival, a Catholic fair. And they also burned one in front of his home. And the interesting part about the cross that was burned in front of his house is that he lived on Beverly just off of Coolidge. He was essentially a block away from the police station in a very small town, 1923. So if a group of men got together and set up a tall cross and lit it on fire a block away from the police station, it's kind of interesting that no one was caught or no one saw anything or no one knew who did it. But this was part of a lot of sort of forceful, sort of ignoring of this problem that would happen a lot throughout the years of sort of pretending it didn't exist or being complicit in some cases, as we see as more and more of these people were elected into office and part of the actual machinery of the town itself. Now, in this first election, Martin did lose. And again, just like in those later elections, it was a very close race. It was down to a few other votes. And as the local papers noted at the time, the slate of candidates that were running for city council were all Martin Loftus candidates. So the Klan preferred candidate won the village presidency, but the other side won the actual council seats. So again, this speaks to where there was a heavy Klan presence in Berkeley, but it wasn't completely monolithic. And there was a lot of people who were opposed to them and opposed to the ideas that they represented. There is one other report from further out of state that during this particular time frame, there were a couple other crosses that were burned in the town between the two that were burned specifically on Martin Loftus's properties. And this may be indicative of the beginning of the actual Klan in Berkeley when it formed its actual Clavern, its chapter. Again, I'm still not entirely sure about that. Okay. Now we talk about the branded pastor. We haven't even gotten to Coughlin yet. He's a ways away. We still have this guy to talk about. This is Pastor Orrin Van Loon, and he was the pastor of the Berkeley Community Church from its founding in the early 1920s. It was one of the first churches in Berkeley itself. The Berkeley Baptists technically edged them out by about a month or so. They got their building up a little bit faster. But this was one of the earliest, and I guess nowadays it is technically the oldest established church in the city. And as I mentioned earlier, very early on during the Klan's sort of friendly expansion phase, they did donate some funds to Mr. Van Loon's church to help pay off the mortgage and build it up. This was in January of 1924. Now, with this story about Van Loon, it's often told over and over again. There's even a local book written about it that speculates on some other alternate theories that may have occurred. What is often overlooked in many of these stories and sort of the apocryphal tales that are told about him is that at the time that he was abducted, Van Loon had very recently been elected to the village commission. It was only a few months after he was elected that he was reported as missing. And then eventually, just a few days after that, he turned back up with this massive brand on his back. But even before, in the period between when he went missing and turned back up, there were already people who were speculating that the Klan had something to do with this. And they were speculating that that was because he had very recently given a speech speaking out against the act of burning crosses. Not that he was speaking out against the Klan or anything that the Klan represented, but specifically about the act of burning crosses. This is something that he, as a Christian minister, he just couldn't countenance with. After he did turn up and they interviewed him in the hospital, he confirmed this. He said that he had gone to a Klan meeting and he'd seen the burning cross and how it had frightened women and children, and he didn't think that that was an appropriate use of the Christian symbol and that it shouldn't be used. And so that's what he wrote a sermon about. He acknowledged that did anger some of his congregants, who he openly admits were members of the Klan. And he says he even lost a few congregants over it. He got some nasty letters. They weren't too happy about what he had said. And so, but this is confounded by the fact that when he did turn up and he did have this horrible disfigurement on his back, he claimed to have no memory of when he was missing. He has no idea who took him, why they took him. He has no memory of the branding itself. And that was the story that he stuck with for the rest of his days, is that he has no memory of what happened. But he was very quick to point out while he was recovering in the hospital that he bore no ill will towards the Klan. And one of his first sermons when he returned was to publicly forgive whoever did this to him, without being too specific about who that might have been. And so this led to some speculation in the local papers that someone else may have done this, or he may have done it to himself. But given what I've sort of examined here, it seems pretty likely that this was a Klansman who had kind of gone rogue. At the time, they were very interested in sort of being law-abiding and presenting themselves as being very law-forward, but at the same time, they also had a history of tar and feathering people and running them out of town on rails and flogging others who sort of disobeyed their orders down south. And so some of that may have just worked its way up north here. Now, in particular, what I suspect is that Van Loon was actually friendly towards the Klan early on. He received this money from them, and on paper, he liked a lot of the things that they were talking about and wasn't necessarily opposed to them. But it wasn't until not only was he this sort of Klan-friendly preacher who started speaking out against cross burnings, but he was also a member of the local city commission, so he had sort of control in the town, and I think that angered some who were both A, looking for political power of their own, and B, not too happy that he was speaking out against the Klan that they were such big fans of. So anyhow, after that whole kerfuffle sort of blew over, a few months later, a fight broke out in the middle of a Berkeley school board meeting. And this was shortly after Van Loon had gone into Angel Elementary School to advertise some evangelical tent services he was offering through the community church. And some people understandably weren't too happy about an evangelical preacher going into the schools and advertising his services to the school children. And that's what it seems like at first, whereas nowadays, I think many people would sort of be upset if a preacher went into their kids' public school and did this. But that wasn't the nature of this particular fight. The man who was so upset was quoted in the Detroit Times as being a member of the Klan, and that he was willing to turn Berkeley into another Heron, Illinois, if Van Loon was allowed to continue his services and do what he liked in the town. Now, when he said that he was going to turn Berkeley into another Heron, Illinois, this was a direct reference to a local, or not local rather, but like a recent news item that had taken place. It was a well-known national news story about an event in Heron, Illinois, that resulted in several people being shot and killed in a standoff between the Klan and local law enforcement. And so this just goes to show that there was definitely some acrimony between the local Klan and through Van Loon. What the exact nature of all those, that contention was, that is sort of left to speculation and still subject to research and debate. Okay, I just got a little note here. I'm running low on time, so I'm going to move forward here on to the next. Now we have Our Lady of Refuge. This was Berkeley's original Catholic church before Our Ladies of La Salette came in. They were originally located at the corner of Catalpa and Kipling, where the tennis courts are nowadays, by the Anderson Middle School. And again, as I'd mentioned before, this building had first seen a cross burnt in front of it in August of 1923. And this would have been shortly after they had moved into town as well. The refuge itself was a mission of St. Mary's in Royal Oak. So it wasn't a standalone congregation or church itself. It was just to meet the needs of the Catholics that lived in Berkeley at the time as it was going through its expansion phase. Now, a few years later, they did enter into a land swap. I'm not sure if this was either with the city or with the school district or some combination of both, but they ended up swapping land, and they moved the whole entire building over to Coolidge and Harvard, basically where La Salette is now. But this was not the La Salette building. This is still the original wood board building that they clad in brick. And shortly after they had moved to that spot, a cross was burned nearby. And this wasn't in some local newspaper. Well, no, in fact, it wasn't in the local newspaper. They neglected to report on that first cross burning, but it was in our own records for our fire department, where we have the fire department responding to a fiery cross at that intersection. And then a week later, another cross is burned almost in the exact same spot. This one isn't actually in the basement of the parsonage that they're building next to the church itself. Now, a few days after this second cross is burned on the Catholic Church property, the Klan gets a letter to the editor published in the Daily Tribune saying that this was not their handiwork. This cross that was burned, it was more like an X. It was not up to our standards. We had nothing to do with this cross burning. They didn't mention the cross burning from the week before. They didn't deny burning that cross, but the second cross was simply not up to their standards. And so they denied having any involvement whatsoever. And that if they did burn a cross, you would know it. It basically is what the sum of that threat was there. And then sure enough, about a month later, a 15-foot cross is burned on the playground of St. Mary's in downtown Royal Oak, to really sort of demonstrate that if you want to see a cross, well, we'll show you what a cross is, in the form of the 15-foot cross lit on fire. And that's the one that was barely mentioned by the newspaper, buried down on page 3 that I had referred to in an earlier slide. So there was definitely a lot of acrimony towards the local Catholics during this particular phase. And again, I haven't even gotten to Coughlin yet. We'll get there soon. But first, we got to talk about Berkeley's first Klan parade and last Klan parade. And this took place in November of 1926. It was basically lined up to coincide with Veterans Day. Veterans Day. Now, throughout this particular time, I had mentioned at the outset that there was parades and picnics that were very commonplace, especially during patriotic holidays during this time. I didn't go into granular detail about all those. There was a couple in Royal Oak, there were a few in Ferndale. But something to note here is that during this early phase in 1923, 24, 25, there was a law that had been passed in Michigan called the Burns Anti-Mask Law. And this was a law that was pretty much aimed directly at the Klan itself and had all these carve-outs so that children could still wear masks on Halloween and things like that. And basically it was written into such a way that it was aimed squarely at preventing masked Klansmen from marching on the streets. And for the first several years, while they were in this mode of trying to present themselves as being patriotic and lawful and American, they were happy to comply with that. With those parades that took place in Washington, D.C., they all had their masks up, and they'd still wear the robes, but they'd have their masks up so that everyone could see their faces, and they were happy to comply with the law because they were all about law and order. But as the decade dragged on, we started to see, especially here in Michigan, there was a little bit of a turn against this law. The Grand Dragon, or the leader of the Michigan Klan, had participated in a parade in Owasso just a few months before Berkeley's parade. And it was noteworthy because he did so with his mask down, and everyone else in the parade did as well. And this was the first time in many years that anyone in Michigan had done that. And he did this very intentionally to sort of challenge the law to see if either A, the police would stop him right then and there, or if B, anyone would try and prosecute him after the fact. And he basically got away with it. He claimed that the parade itself was a historical reenactment. And that was another one of the carve-outs for this law, is that if you were reenacting some historical event, then you could wear masks. And that's what they were doing. And so therefore they were allowed to wear their masks. And so when Berkeley had its own parade, they followed suit. They also put their masks down and they marched. And despite being led by a Berkeley motorcycle police officer, they weren't turned away and stopped. They just continued to march with their masks on. And this sparked a investigation. And now what the results of that investigation were, I don't know. They very scantly reported on this to begin with. We just know that they were going to look into it. And about a year later, the same event kind of unfolded again. There was another parade in Royal Oak where about 1,000 Klansmen paraded. And again, they wore their masks, and someone complained afterwards about it. And the prosecutors just sort of put their hands up. They're like, well, I don't know. They said that they can. They said it was a historical reenactment. They basically had no interest in prosecuting this. And from what I can find so far, no one actually was prosecuted for wearing their masks while parading. So of the 150 members of Berkeley's lone parade, we don't actually know who any of those members were, since they were wearing their masks. But that 150 number is important. And I like to remember that number in particular when I think about those early elections that took place in Berkeley, where the total vote count was 953 voters. And you think about 150 members of the Klan were marching through the streets of Berkeley. Many of them were likely married as well and had wives at home that probably voted the same way they did or very similarly. And so when you have these elections where, the Klan-backed candidate only won by 8 votes or 80 votes, I mean, that's your full vote count right there. That puts you over the top to, run a town. All right, so in like a lion, out like a lamb. As I'd mentioned before, the speed with which they had moved through the state was really, really alarming. They went from 0 to 5 million pretty much in the span of the first 5 years of 1920. And this was matched only pretty much by the speed with which they went right back out again. Membership dropped off pretty quickly, and this was due to a number of different factors. Part of it was the way that the Klan was structured during this time was very much a pyramid shape. New Klan initiates that were brought in each had to pay a $10 donation. And then in order to get their robes and their helmets, they also had to pay a separate fee. And then those robes were provided for them by the imperial robesmen in Atlanta itself. And so a lot of people started to get wise to this whole like, hey man, I'm paying a lot of fees and regular taxes and stuff. And what am I even paying all this for? There were also a couple other scandals that took them down. And there was a lot of press that was happy to write about every failure that they had or every case of infighting that took place between the leadership. And so the membership itself just dropped off very, very quickly nationally. Locally, the same sort of trend continued, at least outwardly, publicly. The parades became less common. The last sort of public event that I found a recording of was in August of 1928, where they held a week-long evangelical sort of tent revival just north of downtown Royal Oak that got expanded for a week. And then after that, they kind of went quiet. We don't hear from them for a while. There's no more parades. There's no more picnics or any spectacles like that. And they kind of fall out. And now you're wondering at this point, wait a minute, you didn't talk about Coughlin yet, but the Klan's gone. Don't worry, I haven't forgotten. Now, the reason I say this more towards the end is because a lot of what happened with Coughlin really happened more in the 1930s, sort of after the proper second wave of the Klan had kind of gone off the scene. And this is really more of a second wave of the Klan. Now, with Coughlin, the first reported incident we have of some sort of Klan-related violence and the radio priest was in 1926. There's no newspaper reporting of this actually occurring, which leads some Coughlin scholars nowadays and historians to wonder if this event actually occurred. But based on the number of cross burnings that took place during this entire time frame, and particularly the cross burnings that took place in front of Catholic churches nearby, I have very little doubt that a cross was burned in front of the Shrine Church sometime in July of 1926. And this would have been just a couple weeks after the original wooden church was built right at the corner of 12 and Woodward. This was long before the Art Deco building was built, long before the Charity Tower was built, just a simple wooden structure. Coughlin had never gone on the radio. No one knew his name. He wasn't some national personality that everyone knew. He was just a new Catholic priest of a new Catholic parish and likely would have been a target of the local Klan for some harassment. Oh gosh, it's 8 o'clock. Sorry, my helper is helping me here. So I'll wrap up real quickly here. Just got a couple more slides. Now, with Coughlin, again, so historians doubted that whether or not this actual initial cross burning did occur. I'm fairly confident that it did. The only way that we know about it is through the stories that Coughlin told himself. And this cross burning that took place in 1926 was supposedly the inspiration for the Charity Tower, which would go on to become the largest crucifixion that was built at the time in 1931. And then for a while, we don't really see much interaction between the Klan and Coughlin. And again, as I mentioned, the Klan had largely died out by the end of the 1920s. Coughlin himself, he started to become more and more radical. As Jules had sort of introduced him a little bit at the beginning of the radio show, his radio rhetoric started to become more and more radical overall. Originally, he was a supporter of FDR in the early 30s, but then after FDR got elected and sort of ignored him, he got sort of bitter about that and started really changing his rhetoric a lot. And it was during this early phase when he started to change his rhetoric and he started to make direct attacks on Capitol itself, that a bomb was thrown into the basement window of his home. This was in 1933. This was during a frame when a lot of things were blowing up and getting set on fire, and I'll talk about that in just a second. But very specifically in this instance, they targeted Coughlin in 1933. It wouldn't be until 3 years later that the original church building would be burned down, and that took place on St. Patrick's Day of 1936. Officially, the cause of the fire was faulty electrical wiring. Officially, the Klan had nothing to do with this. Though, again, with the amount of burnings and violence that was taking place during this time, it seems unlikely that it was coincidental that his church burned down on St. Patrick's Day during this particular time frame. Now, at the time that the church burned down, this is when the church that we understand as Shrine nowadays, it was nearly complete. As you can see in the photo here, in the sort of smoldering ruins of the church itself, you can see the Charity Tower, you can see the current Art Deco church building is nearly complete. It was just a few weeks away from being done, and so they had to speed it up a little bit. So no one was rendered homeless here. And oftentimes when the story about Coughlin and the Klan is retold, people sort of say, oh, well, the Klan came and they burned his church down, so he built this giant tower. And that's not quite how the timeline of this worked out. Again, very, very early on, he was likely antagonized by the Klan, and it wasn't until later in the 30s when a differently motivated, more violent sort of Klan likely targeted his church. And that had more to do with the rhetoric that he was spewing on the radio than it had to do with his Catholicism. And it is an interesting sort of case where you have Coughlin, who was very much an anti-Semite, and he reprinted and serialized copies of the Elders of the Protocol of Zion in his newspaper that he put out on a regular basis. And so there's very little doubt about that. And yet at the same time, he was subject to violence by a bigoted hate group. So, what goes around comes around, I suppose. But there's a whole, this is a subject that could be talked about for an hour unto itself. And unfortunately, I'm going to have to just skip over it for now so we can save some room for questions. All right. So again, in the 1930s, and sort of intertwining with Coughlin himself, we see the depths of the Great Depression itself, and we start to see a lot of people move outside of traditional political structures. Communism becomes a little more popular during this time. People start flirting with socialism a little bit, and we see also a rebirth of the Klan. And during this particular time frame, rather than being focused on Catholics or on Blacks or on Jews, their primary source of anger was with communists and socialists and anyone who was against capitalism. And during this particular time frame, we see a long stretch of different events that took place. Beginning in January of 1933, there was a violent conflict between unemployed workers at the Unemployed Workers Hall and Klansmen in Clawson. Now, the Unemployed Workers Hall, these were communists. And this was just another phrase or term that they used during this particular time. And they did advocate for unemployed workers, try to get them better benefits, try to get rent freezes or rent moratoriums, try to get eviction moratoriums during this time frame. And they were definitely targeted specifically by the Klan. Just a few months after that fist fight in Clawson, a cross is burned at 8 Mile and Woodward, and a sign that reads, "The Klan rides, communism will be destroyed." And I should mention also, during that fight in Clawson, they also had signs there that read very similarly that, communism must be destroyed or will be destroyed. And just a few days after this cross is burned at 8 Mile and Woodward with this sign that reads, "Communism will be destroyed," that's when Coughlin's house was bombed, just less than a week after this was burned. And then just a few days after Coughlin's house is bombed, the Unemployed Workers Hall in downtown Berkeley, I had no idea Berkeley had communists until very recently, but apparently they had a whole hall and everything, and it was burned down. The firemen were able to save the business next door, but unfortunately they were not able to save the Workers Hall itself. And then 4 days after that, the communist camp that was at 12 Mile and Halstead in Farmington was also burned down. none of these particular events were connected to one another. It's just sort of, when you look at all of these things laid out chronologically, it's sort of like, oh, those things are probably related to one another. There's a bunch of communist camps all getting burned down within the span of a week. And at least with the communist camp in Farmington, it did come to light later that a violent offshoot of the Klan, known as the Black Legion, was indeed responsible for that firebombing. And the men who were responsible for it were eventually convicted. What they didn't tie that into was any of the other fire bombings that took place within the week before the communist camp was burned down, and none of that got tied back to them either. So whether they actually did that or not, I don't fully know yet. Again, the Black Legion itself is a subject that could be talked about for an hour unto itself. This was a very militarized version of the Klan that became popular in Michigan, Ohio, a little bit into West Virginia during the 1930s. They didn't care about parades. They didn't care about fun time recruitment or fees or things like that. They were more militarized, and they had like ranks of commander and lieutenant and things like that. They had a military structure in how they were set up, and they were very focused on carrying out specific military objectives. So they had an arson squad who would carry out these arsons and fire bombings, and they had a murder squad, and they had a investigation squad that would investigate their enemies. They targeted multiple people throughout this time, and a lot of their misdeeds came to light after a WPA worker was killed in 1936. And after that happened, Charles Poole was murdered. Basically, large sections of their organization came to light, and they were deeply infiltrated in a number of area police departments, fire departments, the psychiatric hospital in Pontiac, as well as a lot of other city jobs in Pontiac as well. In total, it was 70 some government employees in Oakland County that turned out to be members of this particular group. In Macomb, there was also widespread involvement. There was a grand jury investigation there. There was also an investigation in Wayne County. Just huge organization of members who were often tied in with either local elected office or with their local police departments. As to where this played in with Berkeley, we don't actually know. This is something that I'm very much investigating. It's not something that I'm nearly done looking into at all. But with Berkeley, it seems that they were kind of given a pass. They were this little village. No one really paid much attention to them. And the judge who was in charge of the grand jury investigation had been Berkeley city attorney for, well, a decade. And he had been very much involved in Royal Oak and Berkeley politics for several decades. He really had no business. He should have been recused from this investigation to begin with, because he knew pretty much all the principal players. It was deeply botched from the beginning, but I think that may have been intentional, so that they didn't investigate too hard and pull on too many threads, because that would have gotten embarrassing for a number of people in power. Okay, so that we are over time, and I am going to leave it at that. Get out of this, I don't even know how to, there we go, stop the share. Okay, so that was the very quick Cliff's Notes, very fast version of everything. I'm sure I skipped over a lot of pertinent information, and now would be the time for any questions that anyone might have.
I'll ask a few questions, if you don't mind.
Go ahead, Dale.
In one of those clippings, it seemed like the church was trying to apologize for its acceptance of the Klan showing up occasionally. And they cite another organization that shows up occasionally, refer to them as the CCC. And I'm guessing that's not Civilian Conservation Corps. A little too early for that.
Yeah, you know, I actually don't know about that. I'm assuming they're referring to local communists, but I don't know. I'm guessing that by the context of how they phrase that in that ad. As for I thank you for reminding me about that other incident that was covered in the Indiana version of the Fiery Cross. And like we were talking about before the presentation began, pretty much every week within that publication, they would run a story detailing how a local chapter of the Klan had given money to some local support a building fund or something like that. And in one case, they covered in great detail a pastor who had originally accepted the money, but then he thought better of it once he saw who it came from, and he returned it. And they were not pleased with that, to the point where they ran this whole news story about how this guy had fallen for, lies in the subsidized press. That was their version of fake news back then. And so he had fallen for all these lies about the Klan, and decided not to accept the money, and woe be to him for doing so.
Another thing I was kind of curious about was, the Klan was secretive, so they don't have like regular halls, like Masonic halls or International Order of Odd Fellows halls. But I noticed that you mentioned that they met at a Odd Fellows hall, and I was wondering if there was a fraternal organization that they were most closely associated with at that time, where they were likely to meet, and if that organization was the Odd Fellows.
Right. Well, locally, they didn't have their own Clavering Hall, but that wasn't the case universally during this time frame. There were other cities and other towns where they didn't have their own specific hall that they purchased. In fact, even in Detroit, they had their own headquarters at the corner of John R. and Hancock. So when they were,
Really?
yes, when they were publicly backing candidates for the city council and for mayor, that's where their headquarters were. It was published in the newspaper. They even had a neon KKK sign out front that neighbors would complain about because it was.
Wow. Well, I guess that makes me wonder, as an architectural historian, are there examples in the United States that you know of extant Clavering halls?
I know
And
of
there are so many Masonic halls.
I know of one that exists in Michigan, and it's sure enough is right next to that town's Oddfellows Hall. But getting back to what you were saying before, locally they didn't have their own separate building, their own separate Clavering. And that's just what's reported, is that especially early on, they were frequently meeting at the Oddfellows Hall itself. But that's what the Oddfellows Hall did. They functioned as a meeting space that people could rent out. So that didn't necessarily mean that the Oddfellows were complicit or in favor of the Klan. They were a rental hall, and that's what they did. Now, again, going back to a book I had mentioned earlier, Everyday Klansfolk by Craig Fox, for anyone who wants to know about how the Klan operated in 1920s Michigan, this is an exhaustively detailed look into all of that minutia. It's based on a series of Klan membership records that were uncovered in Western Michigan in the early 2000s, going back to this time frame. And Craig Fox goes into very granular detail. So there was often a lot of overlap with people who were members of the Oddfellows, but there was also a lot of overlap with people who were members of the Masons, as well as some of the lesser known orders like Moose and things like that, as well as the American Legion and military sort of fraternal organizations. There was some overlap there, but there was no one that had a particular stranglehold. Maybe a little bit the Oddfellows, just as far as majority, but they certainly didn't have a monopoly as far as other social organizations that people belonged to.
Gotcha. What was the town that extant Clavering Hall is in?
I will have to get back to you on that.
All right. Hey, I got a few more questions, but I don't want to dominate. And there's also some that are written in the chat. I don't know if you guys have noticed.
Yeah, everyone else is on mute. You're the only one who has the power to unmute yourself.
Wow.
If the moderator, I don't know. I don't see the chat.
Oh,
So.
Dale, go ahead and ask whatever you want. It's fine.
Okay, well, I noticed that you mentioned you touched on some fire records, which is really interesting resource for me, because before you even mentioned it, I was thinking, what other weird research avenues did you happen to find tidbits here and there that weren't from newspapers? And specifically, you said that there was a legal case in Huntington Woods, and I was wondering if you'd hunted down any legal abstracts regarding that case.
No, I haven't. That's not something that I've tried to hunt down too much. I found the newspaper article about it, and I found that was, an interesting example of it actually occurring here, and not just being an abstract concept that only white people could buy land here, but it was actually legally enforced by our local courts.
Gotcha. Well, the legal profession is so good at record keeping that may be something you want to look into, because there might be an abstract of that case out there that'll give you some more information about it. Okay, I'm going to ask one more. In one of those clippings, it mentions that a woman fries an egg on the embers of the burnt cross. Is there a symbolic gesture of some sort?
Yeah, I think that the overall tone of that article, if you read through the rest of the column, it basically is just trying to point out that of the Berkeley residents who weren't members of the Klan, who were perhaps the target of these fiery crosses, that they didn't take it too seriously. They were not threatened by this, and so they were sort of making light of this cross being burned in the street and making jokes out of it.
Okay.
They weren't being cowed or feared by these acts.
Well, then I like that gesture.
Right.
All right, thank you.
Mhm.
Anyone else? Hey, do you want me to read those chat questions to you, Jason?
I mean, there should be Jules, what's going on here?
You can, people who have questions should ask whatever questions they want. I mean.
Oh, here's the chat. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm not too tech
Don't
savvy.
look to me for technical assistance. Wrong guy. So that's when we need our librarian.
Okay, so I see the questions here. So the first one here is from Steve, and it says if city elections were so very close in Berkeley in the 20s, is it fair to say that circa 50% of voting polls in Berkeley were Klan friendly? I don't know about 50%. That might be a little bit high. Klan friendly, yes, because they would win by 50.01%. So, but people voted for a lot of other reasons that weren't strictly because of the Klan. And even for those candidates, I'm careful to say that they were Klan-backed candidates as opposed to Klansmen who were candidates, because I don't actually know that for a fact. All I know is that the Klan supported certain candidates and that those candidates won. As far as 50%, I wouldn't say that's accurate, but this is something that I did want to speak on before, is that when you had very organized efforts at electioneering in big cities like Detroit, which was the biggest city at the time, still is. But there were a lot of other competing interests in the city. So you had people who wanted this, who wanted that. And so the Klan was just one of many, many voices that was trying to be heard within a larger framework. Whereas in Berkeley, you didn't have that huge assortment of voices. You had the Klan, which as a per capita of the overall population, which at the time was only about 5,000 people, it was much larger than it was in say Detroit, even though Detroit overall had way more Klansmen running around in the city proper, but it also had millions of people living in the city, if that makes sense.
Jason,
Thank you.
can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, it's Jeffrey. What was the date and what was the actual location on 12 Mile of the Communist Hall that was burned? This is
The
new to me.
was
This is something
burned
I've not.
on April 4th of 1933. Wait, let me just double check my notes. I think that's correct. Should have been April 4th. Yeah, it was reported in the April 5th Detroit Free Press, but it occurred on April 4th. Detroit.
It's interesting. I've never heard that story before.
Well, that I knew about that case from my studies with the Black Legion, because I knew that case had been adjudicated by the grand jury eventually. It kind of blew my mind to realize that the Berkeley Communist Hall burned down only 3 days before that, and doesn't get any mention whatsoever in the court cases about the Black Legion. It seems, again, just too coincidental to be a coincidence.
Thank you.
I have
Okay.
a question.
Yes.
Are any, I wrote it in the chat, but are any of those Caucasian only laws still on the books?
Well, I mean, they're still on the books as far as the actual restriction language. It's still tied to titles, and this was discussed in the previous series of talks about processes that people can go through in order to get these sort of legal documents removed from their title. But the way that real estate law, from the way I understand it, is structured, basically it's really hard to do, and those are kind of stuck with the title of your home. That being said, the laws themselves aren't enforceable in any way, shape, or form. You can't actually do anything with the laws that are attached to your particular deed, but they still are there.
Okay.
You are saying, Jason, that on some of sometimes old deeds in restricted communities, that language is still extant on the
Oh yeah,
paperwork?
it's widespread throughout Berkeley and Huntington Woods, throughout all this entire area.
Everywhere, not
Yeah.
not just here.
Well, yeah, it just as far as locally, you'll find it pretty much everywhere, except for Southfield doesn't really have much of it because it was mostly farms until the 50s. After most of these restrictions were no longer legally enforceable.
Well, I'm going to read mine more closely then.
You might be surprised what you find.
Okay.
Okay, so we need baseball.
Anyone else?
Jason's reading my question.
Yeah, well, it's that one's not so much a what was the date the Communist Hall burned on 12 Mile? That was Jeff that asked that. That was on April 1st. Let's see. Kathy's iPad throughout the library at Wayne State University has primary documents on the Black Legion, and that is absolutely true. There's a ton of documents. There's a ton of stuff on even the second wave Klan that I don't have yet. I know it exists, but I haven't actually seen it. A lot of our universities here in Michigan have a lot of these periodicals and other articles and sort of artifacts of this era. It's just not digitized, and during this era of COVID, it's not a huge priority for me to go raiding university libraries for minutia about an organization that existed 100 years ago. I'll get to it eventually, but I just haven't gotten there yet. Yes, Susan.
Since the Ku Klux Klan is obviously still in existence, how about the Black Klan?
Yes and no. The Black Legion itself as an organization, it pretty much disappeared in the 1930s when everything came to light. But organizations that are like that, I mean, the Klan still exists today in theory on paper, but I'd say more people are with the hip new organizations nowadays rather than with the Klan. And they're oh so proud of it. So versions of it and the tactics that they used, I certainly see that every day today. That's very commonplace. These sort of structures that are very focused on traditional values and the sanctity of protecting womanhood and certain divisions in society that should exist and superiority of some over others. Yeah, we see that today a lot in a lot of different groups. They have different names, but they operate in pretty much the exact same function and fashion.
Jason, we did have a man come into the museum one day who claimed he lived in Berkeley, would not give me his address, but claimed he had knocked out a wall, and in the wall he had found a Klan outfit.
Yeah, you had mentioned that before.
And he never returned, and we've never been able to track him down, but I see no reason not to believe it.
Probably lost to history at this point. It's interesting that they found it hidden in the wall, because during this particular era, during the more pyramid scheme type framework that they had, was that you had to pay for your robes and you had to pay for the helmet. But if for any reason you were no longer in good standing with the Klan, if you got kicked out or if you left, you had to give back your robe and your helmets. They got to keep it even though you paid for it. And part of that was just maintaining secrecy so that they wouldn't, find some random robe in someone's attic 10 years down the road and all that kind of stuff. But also it was because it was a scam, and it was a way of, then they could resell that robe and helmet to someone else for the same money they had charged you for it. But yeah, it wouldn't surprise me. If they did, they would go out of their way to hide it. With this cache of records that was found in Western Michigan, they were hidden behind a false wall in the attic. And it just so happens that this man was the recording secretary for the local clavern in Newaygo County. And so he still had all these records, even though they had their own internal sort of procedures and policies where he was supposed to destroy those records. He just never did. And much more lucky are we for that, because now we get to learn all these sordid little details. Okay, why does this history matter now? What are the consequences in the present from the Klan's activity down the decades? Well, you see, the creation of this town, and it coincided with this widespread group that was focused on dividing people along very bright lines. And even today, if you look on a map, you'll see that those very bright lines still exist. Greenfield is one of those bright lines. On one side, it's very, very white. On one side, it's very, very not. You know, if you go to the trench of 696, on one side, it's very, very white. On the other side, it's very, very not. And these bright lines exist for a reason into this modern day. And a lot of it had to do with the structures, both legally and both infrastructurally, that were being created 100 years ago, when a lot of these communities were coming into existence, and just had the really bad timing of coming into existence during the largest and most popular spread of this hate group in American history. Any other questions? Mark.
I don't see any other questions, Jason. I wanted to thank you. This was really enlightening, really interesting. Thank you to Jules for tracking you down and making the arrangements for you to do the presentation. It is being recorded and we'll put it up on our YouTube channel. And I want to thank you again for taking the time to make the presentation tonight.
Yeah, I also want to echo that, and also just say I hope that when this pandemic lockdown comes to an end, I think that our friend Dennis McDavid, the superintendent of schools in Berkeley, would probably be good to engage with him with high school students. So, you know, the old admonition about those who ignore history are deemed to repeat it. And I mean, what we saw yesterday in the Capitol and the Proud Boys and all this kind of stuff, you know, I think the relevance of your topic isn't just relevant and germane, it's almost ironic, the date of the presentation. So I appreciate it, but I think that that your materials and your information would do high school students a great deal of good to learn this and to be aware of what the history was. I mean, you drive down 12 Mile and you don't exactly think of it as a place where the Klan was organizing and marching and stuff like that. I mean, none of us think that, and it's true. And so I think that, like I said, what we're dealing with today in terms of generating public policy, that this is extremely helpful for us to hear. And we appreciate very much the time you spent to put this together. I do appreciate Dr. Richardson also helping us out with this. I commend that book to you again. And I don't know whether we have it in our library. I hope we do, but the publisher for it is arcadiapublishing.com, and it's simply entitled Images of America, Berkeley. It's a very, very well-written book. It doesn't go into the detail that Jason did today, but it's a very, very interesting book about our neighbor. And I believe there are some similar books written about other local suburban areas as well. And I really find that very, very, very easy to read and very informative. So once again, on behalf of our mayor, Bob Paul, Jeff Jenks, Michelle Elder, Joe Rosell, myself, and Amy Sullivan, we appreciate the time you devoted to this tonight. And you could see by the turnout, people were very interested in what you had to say. Appreciate everybody's being here, participating, in the questions that everybody put together and asked. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jason.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, bye-bye.